let's look at different powers of I to see if we notice anything. We know that I to the first power, is the square root of -1. And we know that we could just write that as I, right? All right, I to the second power is the square root of -1 times itself. So we know that's like saying the square root of -1 squared, which we learned and we looked at extensively in the previous lesson. When you square something that's being square rooted, you're left with just what's inside. And then now let's look at I cubed. Well, I cubed, we've got square root of -1, square root of -1, square root of -1, right? Because it's cubed, so it's multiplied, used as a factor 3 times and multiplied together. We know that these two will give us -1. And we know that this is just equal to I. So I cubed will give us -I. And then we've got the last one, the last one for right now, I to the fourth. I to the fourth, we've got square root of -1, square root of -1, square root of -1, and square root of -1. So again, these two multiplied together will give us -1. And these two multiplied together will give us -1. And -1 times -1 is 1. All right, let's do a few more. Let's do I to the fifth. Well, if you remember your exponent rules, we can break I to the fifth up into I to the fourth times I to the first. We know that I to the fourth is 1. And we know that I to the first is just I. So we end up with I. Let's look at I to the sixth. We can do the same thing. We can break this up into I to the fourth times I squared. So that equals 1 times I squared. And we know from right over on the left side that I squared is -1. Let's look at I to the seventh. That's going to be I to the fourth times I to the third. Notice I'm always doing I to the fourth because I know that if I can separate it into an I to the fourth and then something else, I know that I to the fourth is 1. So then that's going to give me 1 times I to the third, which is 1 times -I. And then I to the eighth. I to the eighth is I to the fourth times I to the fourth. And I to the fourth is 1. So that's 1 times 1, which is just 1. So what we end up seeing is this repeated pattern. And I'm going to do the next 4, but I'm not going to write them all out. But what we see is that I to the first is I. I to the second is -1. I to the third is -I. And I to the fourth is 1. And we see that same pattern repeating. We get I, then we get -1, then we get -I, then we get 1. So if I were to do the next 4 powers, if I were to do I to the 9th, I to the 10th, I to the 11th, and I to the 12th, I know that I'm going to continue the pattern. This one's going to be I'm just looking right here. This one's going to be -1. This one's going to be -I. This one's going to be +1. So it repeats every 4 powers, right? 1 through 4, then 5 through 8, then 9 through 12, then 13 through 16, right? It's going to keep repeating. It's going to keep cycling through. So let's see how we can use this. Knowing that this pattern is going to repeat, let's see how we can use this to take different powers of I. All right, let's say I've got something like I to the 15th. Well, I to the 15th I can write as I to the 4th, and then I can do another 4, right? So far I've got 8. I can do another 4, that's 12, and then that would leave me with 3. So that's going to be 1 times 1 times 1 times I to the 3rd. And if you can't remember what I to the 3rd is, really, just do this again. -1, -1, -1. These two are equal to -1. This is equal to I. So we get -I. Now, what would really be helpful is if you made yourself a little chart that listed them out. So I'm going to do that here off to the side, just as a reminder, make it a little bit easier as I'm going through and simplifying these, that I've got I to the 1st, and that's just I. Then I've got I to the 2nd, which is -1. I to the 3rd is -I. I to the 4th is 1. Now, that's going to help me, especially now when I've got a number like 34. Because listen, I could do this same thing that I did up here and do like, okay, it's I to the 4th, and then another 4, 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 and then just keep counting up until I get close to 34. But what might be easier than that is to divide 34 by 4 to see how many of those I would have, and then how much I would have left over. So if I do 4 into 34, it goes 8 times with a remainder of 2. So that means I would have to write I to the 4th, I to the 4th, I to the 4th, I to the 4th 8 times, which I don't really want to do because I know that all of them are just going to be 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times, right? So it means that I would have 1 8 times, and then I'd have 2 left over, which would give me I squared. So the way that you could write this 8 remainder 2, if you wanted to have those numbers represented as exponents, would be 1 to the 8th times I to the 2nd. All right, the 8 comes from here, and the 2 comes from our remainder. So 1 to the 8th power is just 1. And then I squared, if I look over at my little table over here on the right, I squared is -1. Right? Make my ones have little, I don't want them to look like the eyes, so I want them to separate, look separate, look different. Okay, so -1. So let's try that here. With this one, I've got I to the 48th. So 48 divided by 4 is 12. Right? So that means, but I have no remainder. So that means I've just got 1 to the 12th power, which is just 1. All right, let's try one more. Let's say we've got, let's do I to the, let's do trying to think of a good one. I to the 75th. All right, I to the 75th. So we're going to divide by 4. I'll do that down here. 4 into 75 goes once. That's 35. That goes in 8 times. And I get a remainder of 3. So that means I'm going to have 1 to the 18th power, because that's the answer I got right here. And then I'm going to have I to the 3rd power, because that's my remainder. Okay, so the number of times it goes in, that's how many 1s you have, so 1 to that power. And then the remainder is how many i's we're multiplying together. And from my chart over here, I'm going to put another little star around it, I know that I to the 3rd is negative I. So that's it. So that means that I to the 15th and I to the 75th both come out to be negative I. They both come out to be the same thing.